India and Cold War politics, strategic autonomy in a bipolar world. Introduction, Cold War structure and the emergence of post-colonial strategy. Cold War constituted one of the most significant and structurally rigid international systems in modern history. Between 1947 and 1991, global politics were defined by ideological, military, and economic competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. The bipolar distribution of power constrained the strategic options available to newly independent states. India emerged as one of the most significant post-colonial actors navigating this environment. Having achieved independence in 1947, after nearly 2 centuries of British colonial rule, India faced immediate structural pressures from the emerging international order. The global environment incentivized alignment with either capitalist or socialist blocs, yet India adopted an alternative strategic approach that emphasized autonomy, sovereignty, and flexibility. The doctrine of non-alignment became the core instrument through which India attempted to maintain independence of action while simultaneously extracting economic and military resources from competing superpowers. This strategic choice reflected both ideological commitments and pragmatic constraints, revealing the complex interaction between domestic developmental needs and external geopolitical pressures. Intellectual foundations of Indian foreign policy under Nehru. India's Cold War foreign policy cannot be understood without examining the intellectual and ideological influence of Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru conceptualized international relations as a domain in which newly decolonized states could resist structural domination by major powers. His understanding of global politics incorporated elements of liberal internationalism, anti-colonial nationalism, and socialist developmentalism. Nehru believed that formal alliance structures would reduce India's sovereignty and limit policy autonomy. Instead, he argued that newly independent states should create a third strategic space between the superpowers. The concept of non-alignment was therefore not passive neutrality, but rather an active diplomatic posture that allowed India to pursue issues based on cooperation with both blocs. Nehru also viewed international institutions and multilateral diplomacy as mechanisms through which weaker states could amplify their voice. His worldview was shaped by the experience of colonial exploitation, which reinforced the importance of economic self-reliance and political independence. Consequently, Indian foreign policy was constructed as a hybrid framework combining moral rhetoric with strategic calculation. The structural logic of non-alignment. Non-alignment represented a rational response to the constraints imposed by bipolarity. In a system dominated by superpowers, alignment entails significant opportunity costs. States that formally joined one bloc risked becoming dependent on that bloc's economic and security structures. India's decision to avoid formal alliance commitments allowed it to maintain bargaining leverage by refusing to commit exclusively to either the United States or the Soviet Union. India preserved the capacity to negotiate economic aid, military assistance, technological cooperation from both sides. The non-aligned movement institutionalized this strategy by creating a coalition of states that collectively resisted superpower dominance. Through NAM, India attempted to reshape the structure of international relations by promoting multipolar norms. The movement emphasized sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-intervention, and peaceful coexistence. These principles reflected both normative commitments and strategic objectives, allowing India to legitimize its independent foreign policy posture. Economic development and state-led industrialization. Cold War dynamics influenced India's domestic economic model. Indian policymakers concluded that economic dependence on advanced capitalist economies could reproduce colonial patterns of extraction. As a result, India adopted a development strategy centered on state-led industrialization and import substitution. The objective was to reduce reliance on foreign goods while building domestic industrial capacity. Central planning institutions such as the Planning Commission were designed to coordinate investments across sectors including heavy industries, infrastructure, and scientific research. The Cold War environment reinforced that perception that economic autonomy was a prerequisite for political independence. India's engagement with the Soviet Union facilitated access to industrial technology and technical expertise, particularly in sectors such as steel production, heavy engineering, and energy infrastructure. This approach reflected the belief that long-term sovereignty required the development of domestic productive capacity. However, the emphasis on state control also produced inefficiencies and limited integration into global markets. The economic consequences of this model would become increasingly visible by the late war period. United States India relations during the Cold War. India's relationship with the United States was characterized by cooperation interspersed with tension. During the early post-independence period, the United States provided economic assistance through developmental programs aimed at supporting India's modernization efforts. However, ideological differences quickly emerged. India's commitment to non-alignment conflicted with American expectations that developing countries would align with the Western bloc. Divergence became particularly evident during conflicts involving Pakistan. The United States viewed Pakistan as a strategic partner in containing Soviet influence in South Asia. American military assistance to Pakistan generated mistrust within Indian strategic circles. India also criticized American interventions in conflicts such as the Vietnam War, reinforcing perception of ideological distance between the two countries. Despite these disagreements, economic cooperation continued in areas such as agricultural development, technology transfer. The relationship therefore remained complex and multidimensional, reflecting both strategic competition and pragmatic engagement. The Indo-Soviet Union strategic partnership. India's relationship with the Soviet Union evolved into a significant strategic partnership. The Soviet Union supported India's industrial development through technical cooperation and investment in infrastructure projects. Soviet military assistance played a crucial role in modernizing Indian armed forces. The partnership deepened following geopolitical crises in South Asia. The Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation in 1971 formalized a long-term strategic alignment. Soviet diplomatic support during the 1971 Indo-Pakistan War demonstrated the practical benefits of maintaining close relations with a major power while avoiding formal alliance structures. India leveraged Soviet cooperation to enhance its defense capabilities, particularly in areas such as aviation, naval systems, and armored warfare. The Indo-Soviet relationship illustrated how alignment didn't imply equidistance but rather strategic flexibility. India adjusted its partnership in response to changing security environments while preserving the rhetorical commitment to autonomy. Regional security challenges and strategic adaptation. India's geopolitical environment included multiple regional threats that influence its foreign policy decisions. Conflicts with China and Pakistan exposed vulnerabilities in Indian defense preparedness. The Sino-Indian War of 1962 demonstrated the limitations of strategic assumptions regarding peaceful coexistence. The conflict compelled India to reassess its defense strategy and accelerate military modernization. Similarly, Indo-Pakistan conflicts in 1965 and 71 revealed the extent to which regional disputes were embedded within a global Cold War dynamics. Superpower involvement influenced diplomatic outcomes and military calculations. The creation of Bangladesh in 1971 represented a major strategic shift in South Asia. The conflict illustrated how regional wars could intersect with global power competition. India's strategic decision making increasingly incorporated considerations related to alliance politics, technological capability, and nuclear deterrence. Nuclear policy and strategic deterrence. India's nuclear program emerged with the context of Cold War security competition. Regional threats from China and Pakistan reinforced that perceived necessity of developing an independent deterrent capability. In 1974, nuclear tests demonstrated India's technological capacity and strategic intent. Policymakers justified the nuclear program as a means of preserving sovereignty in an uncertain international environment. Nuclear capability enhanced India's bargaining power by reducing vulnerability to coercion. The pursuit of nuclear technology also reflected broader ambitions related to scientific modernization and technological self-reliance. Cold War dynamics therefore accelerated India's investment in research institutions, engineering education, and significant infrastructure. Nuclear policy became a central component to India's long-term strategic planning. The non-aligned movement as a platform of collective agency. The non-aligned movement provided India with an institutional platform through which it could exercise diplomatic leadership. NAM enabled developing countries to coordinate positions on issues such as decolonization, apartheid, economic inequality, and disarmament. India's partnership in NAM summits reinforced its international legitimacy as a representative of post-colonial interests. The movement also functioned as a mechanism for coalition building among states with similar structural constraints. By promoting multilateral cooperation, India sought to increase the bargaining power of developing states within global institutions. NAM therefore operated both as an ideological project and a strategic instrument. It allowed India to shape international discourse while simultaneously protecting its own policy autonomy. Economic constraints and structural limitations. Despite its strategic achievements, India's Cold War policies generated economic challenges. They emphasized on state-led development, limited private sector growth, and reduced integration into global trade networks. Import substitution strategy protected domestic industries but also reduced competitiveness. Bureaucratic inefficiencies and regulatory constraints showed technological diffusion. By the late Cold War period, economic stagnation created pressure for reform. India began to reconsider aspects of its economic model, leading to gradual liberalization in the early 1990s. The transition reflected recognition that strategic autonomy required economic dynamism as well as political independence. Cold War economic policies therefore reduced both institutional capacity. Strategic success of India's Cold War policies. India's Cold War strategy achieved several objectives. The country preserved sovereignty despite structural pressure to align with major powers. It developed industrial capacity across key sectors including steel, energy, and defense manufacturing. India emerged as a diplomatic leader among developing nations. The non-alignment doctrine increased flexibility in international negotiations. India also avoided becoming a proxy battleground for superpower conflict. These outcomes reflect the effectiveness of strategic autonomy as a long-term policy framework. The combination of diplomatic activism and domestic capacity building allowed India to navigate a complex international environment. Strategic failures and constraints. India's Cold War approach also revealed limitations. Non-alignment did not prevent external pressure from major powers. Military weaknesses were exposed during conflicts with China and Pakistan. Economic policies generated inefficiencies that constrained growth. Dependence on foreign technology remained significant despite efforts to promote self-reliance. India's diplomatic balancing strategy occasionally created ambiguity rather than strategic commitments. These limitations illustrate the inherent difficulty of maintaining autonomy in a polarized international system. Strategic flexibility required continuous adjustment in response to changing geopolitical conditions. Post-Cold War continuities in Indian foreign policy. The legacy of Cold War decision-making continues to influence India's contemporary foreign policy. Modern Indian strategy emphasizes multi-alignment rather than strict non-alignment. India engages simultaneously with the United States, Russia, and other global powers. The principle of strategic autonomy remains central to policy formulation. India participates in international institutions while avoiding formal alliance commitments that could restrict independence of action. Contemporary initiatives such as strategic partnerships and economic cooperation agreements reflect adaptation of Cold War doctrines to multipolar environment. The persistence of autonomy-oriented thinking demonstrates that enduring influence of Cold War experiences on strategic Indian culture. Conclusion: strategic autonomy as a long-term doctrine. India's engagement with Cold War politics illustrates how emerging power can navigate structurally constrained environments. Non-alignment functioned as a mechanism for maximizing policy flexibility while minimizing dependency. The combination of diplomatic activism, economic planning, and military modernization allowed India to preserve sovereignty during the period of intense geopolitical competition. The Cold War experience shaped institutional structures that continue to influence Indian foreign policy even in the 21st century. Strategic autonomy remains a central organizing principle, guiding India's interaction with global powers. The Cold War therefore represents not merely a historical episode, but a foundational phase in the evolution of India's international identity.